In 2002, a tragic and chilling tale unfolded that shook the quiet town of Fayetteville, North Carolina. This is the story of David Shannon, a man whose life and death revealed a dark and tangled web of family drama, manipulation, and deception. David Shannon was an Army major from Lincoln, North Dakota, a man who stood out not for his social prowess, but for his quiet resolve. Growing up, David was a reserved, shy individual with few friends and no interest in sports. Instead, his focus was singular and clear from a young age. He wanted to join the Army. At just 19, he enlisted, following his childhood dream with unwavering determination. In 1991, David's life took a significant turn when he married Joan, a woman whose past was as tumultuous as David's was stable. Joan was born in Rochester, New York, and her childhood was marked by hardship. At just 12 years old, Joan came home from school one day to find her parents gone, having abandoned her. She moved in with her older sister, but that arrangement didn't last long, leading Joan to spend time in foster care. Despite these early struggles, Joan was resilient. She graduated high school, got married, and had two daughters, Elizabeth and Daisy. Unfortunately, her marriage didn't survive, but Joan's drive to provide for her children never wavered. She earned a business degree in 1990, determined to build a better life for her family. In a twist of fate, Joan met David Shannon. Their connection was immediate, and it seemed they were meant to be together. David adopted Joan's daughters, and together they built a life in Fayetteville, North Carolina. David worked as a computer specialist for the Army, and the family experienced the typical ups and downs of military life, including frequent moves. In 2000, the Shannons settled at Fort Bragg. They had two sons of their own, adding to the family mix. However, as the years went by, the Shannon household became a battleground. Elizabeth and Daisy, now teenagers, were infamous around town for their rebellious behavior. Their after-school parties were notorious for drugs, boys, and violence, much to the frustration of their parents and the dismay of their neighbors. The Shannons' home became a hotbed of conflict. Daisy at 17 became pregnant, and Elizabeth at 15 was expelled from school for fighting. Joan was overwhelmed and out of options, so she turned to David for help. David, being a strict military man, took on the task of disciplining the girls. He set strict rules and tried to enforce order, but his methods only seemed to drive the family further apart. The situation continued to deteriorate until it reached a breaking point. In the summer of 2002, David Shannon's life came to a shocking end. The discovery of his body and the subsequent investigation revealed a story far darker than anyone could have anticipated. It became clear that the tensions within the Shannon household had escalated to a tragic and violent climax. As authorities delved into the case, they uncovered layers of deceit and manipulation. The investigation peeled back the facade of a family struggling with its own demons, exposing the severe consequences of their unresolved issues. The once quiet Army major was now at the center of a murder investigation that would unravel a disturbing narrative of family discord and betrayal. The Shannon case stands as a haunting reminder of how hidden conflicts and personal struggles can spiral into catastrophic outcomes. From a childhood marked by abandonment to a home rife with chaos and conflict, the Shannon family's story is a stark illustration of how beneath the surface of everyday life can lie profound darkness. In the summer of 2002, Fayetteville, North Carolina, was about to be rocked by a scandalous and tragic series of events that revealed the hidden chaos behind a seemingly ordinary family. This is the story of David and Joan Shannon, a couple whose lives spiraled into a dramatic and deadly showdown. David Shannon was the epitome of a tough, disciplined Army major. He was the enforcer in the Shannon household, tasked with maintaining order and discipline, especially when it came to his stepdaughter, Elizabeth. Despite his best efforts, Elizabeth had a knack for defying her stepfather's rules. When David grounded her, she would sneak out through her bedroom window. No matter how many locks or alarms David installed, Elizabeth always found a way to escape. At one point, David even reached out to his own mother for advice on handling the rebellious teenager, but his attempts to control the situation seemed to only escalate the tension at home. While David and Joan's home life was fraught with struggles, the couple themselves appeared to be managing well. They enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle, despite the constant disruptions caused by their daughter's behavior. Seeking some excitement, they ventured into the swinging lifestyle, meeting other couples online and occasionally hosting these encounters discreetly at their home, away from the prying eyes of their children. However, Elizabeth and Daisy were not oblivious to the changes. They noticed the disarray in their rooms upon returning from sleepovers and sensed that something was off. David's online escapades included connecting with a man named Jeffrey Wilson, known online as Black Stuntman. Their discussions often revolved around the swinging lifestyle. As their online friendship deepened, David extended an invitation for Jeffrey to meet his wife, Joan. The two arranged to meet at a swingers party, where their social interactions eventually turned physical. This initial encounter led to a second swingers event, and it wasn't long before Joan and Jeffrey's relationship blossomed into a full-blown affair. Despite the rules that David and Joan had established, rules specifically against romantic entanglements with others, Joan and Jeffrey's bond grew stronger. Jeffrey, a married man with his own family, kept his affair a secret from his wife. As Joan and Jeffrey's relationship intensified, David noticed the growing closeness and became increasingly suspicious. He confronted Joan, demanding that she end her affair with Jeffrey. The affair had breached the boundaries they had set, and David's frustration mounted as he realized how deeply Joan was involved with Jeffrey. On the night of July 23, 2002, the quiet town of Fayetteville, North Carolina, was jolted awake by a horrific scene that would unravel a twisted tale of betrayal and deception. When first responders arrived at the Shannon home, they were greeted by Joan Shannon, who was frantic but oddly calm. Joan reported a chilling scenario. She had been awakened by a gunshot, witnessed an intruder standing over her husband David, and then saw the assailant flee into the night. But here's where things took a strange turn. Despite the traumatic event she described, Joan's demeanor seemed disconcertingly composed. She wasn't crying, shaking, or showing signs of the expected shock. Now everyone processes trauma differently, and Joan could have been in shock. However, her calmness struck many as unusual, especially given the circumstances. Detective Murphy, the lead investigator, entered the house to find David Shannon's lifeless body in bed, having sustained fatal gunshot wounds to both his head and chest. It was a gruesome scene. In a house that was supposed to be a sanctuary, the chaos inside was startling. Two young boys, ages 7 and 10, were sound asleep and had not heard a thing. Joan mentioned that her 17-year-old daughter was out of town, leaving Elizabeth, the 15-year-old, and her friend Vera Thompson, also 15, as the only other occupants in the house that night. Elizabeth and Vera were found in a separate room, having fallen asleep while listening to music and watching TV. Their presence was noted but didn't immediately explain the oddities of the scene. What really raised red flags for the investigators was Joan's lack of blood on her clothes. Given that she claimed to have been sleeping beside David when he was shot, it was peculiar that she appeared so pristine. Blood residue, or the lack thereof, suggested a discrepancy in her account. As Detective Murphy and his team combed through the Shannon home, they were met with a grim reality. The place was a mess. Dishes were piled high in the sink, food was scattered across countertops, and the bedroom was a chaotic jumble of clothes and clutter. It was clear that the house had not been maintained, adding to the overall sense of disorder. The scene was so disorganized that it made the search for evidence and DNA incredibly challenging. Detective Murphy and his team had to meticulously sift through the disarray to ensure they didn't miss any critical clues. Every piece of evidence was crucial in piecing together the events of that fateful night. The situation in the Shannon home was a puzzle with many missing pieces. Joan's calm demeanor, the disarray of the house, and the absence of evidence on her clothes all painted a complex picture. As the investigation continued, the questions multiplied. Who was the mysterious intruder? Why was Joan's account so inconsistent with the physical evidence? And most importantly, what was the true story behind David Shannon's tragic death? The unfolding drama was far from over. The investigators were about to dive deep into the tangled web of Joan Shannon's life, uncovering secrets and lies that would reveal the shocking truth behind the murder. This case was set to expose the dark underbelly of a family seemingly normal on the surface, but rife with hidden conflicts and betrayals. With no clear leads, Detective Murphy and his team interviewed everyone at the house, including Elizabeth, Joan's 15-year-old daughter, and her friend Vera Thompson. Both girls gave statements that matched, but with nothing concrete to go on, they were released. Detective Murphy found himself grappling with a crucial question. Who had a motive to kill David Shannon? Was it a professional hit? Possibly linked to his job? Nothing seemed to add up. But then, a significant piece of information came to light. David had a life insurance policy worth $700,000. Suddenly, Joan's potential motives for murder seemed more tangible. Was she involved in her husband's death to cash in on the policy and escape her marriage? As the investigation continued, the police set up a tip line through Crime Stoppers. Anonymous tips started pouring in, including one that claimed Elizabeth had been bragging about her involvement in the murder. Detective Murphy decided to bring Vera back for further questioning. This time, Vera was visibly shaken and confessed she didn't want to get anyone into trouble. But she soon began to reveal the full story. According to Vera, just days before the shooting, she and Elizabeth had gone to a field to test fire a gun. The police followed up on Vera's account, discovering shell casings where she had described. Vera also disclosed that Elizabeth had discarded the gun after David's murder. She mentioned a local guy, D. Humphrey, who had picked up the weapon. The police tracked down Humphrey, and he confirmed taking the gun from Elizabeth. Vera's detailed account seemed to align perfectly with the evidence. But the real bombshell came next. Vera claimed that Joan and Elizabeth had plotted David's murder together. According to Vera, Elizabeth had pulled the trigger, while Joan masterminded the plan. Joan was the brains and Elizabeth was the muscle. With this new revelation, arrest warrants were swiftly issued for both Joan and Elizabeth. Joan was apprehended while attending David's funeral, surrounded by his grieving family. Despite her claims of innocence and her visible distress over her husband's death, the evidence was overwhelming. Joan's claim that she had no part in David's murder was met with skepticism, especially from David's family, who had always considered Joan to be an unlikely perpetrator. They were convinced that Elizabeth had been a troublemaker and was capable of cold-blooded acts. The case took a shocking turn with the arrests of Joan and Elizabeth Shannon. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that behind the facade of a grieving widow and a troubled teenager lay a sinister conspiracy. The Shannon family's tragic story revealed a dark narrative of betrayal and manipulation, highlighting how hidden motives and personal vendettas can lead to devastating consequences. At just 15 years old, Elizabeth was brought to the police station where she was read her Miranda rights. Detective Murphy, leading the investigation, spent 2 grueling hours questioning her about David's murder. It wasn't long before Elizabeth cracked and confessed, laying bare the shocking details of the night's events. Elizabeth revealed that her mother, Joan, had been plotting David's murder for months. Joan's attempts to poison him had failed, and she even tried to enlist one of Elizabeth's friends to carry out the crime. When those plans fell through, Joan turned to Elizabeth, asking her directly if she was brave enough to do the deed. For Elizabeth, the request from her mother was a twisted form of affection. Their relationship had always been strained, and this moment of attention from Joan, coupled with the promise of a more involved, caring relationship, was something Elizabeth had craved for years. Joan's manipulative tactics included taking Elizabeth shopping and spending time together, activities that seemed to come with an ultimatum: commit the murder or lose it all. Elizabeth, desperate for a connection with her mother and influenced by Joan's promise of a better relationship, agreed. She procured the gun in advance and planned to dispose of it after the murder. That night, as her parents slept, Elizabeth sneaked into their room. She placed the gun over David's head and fired. She then shot him again in the chest, ensuring the job was done. The prosecutor, who believed Elizabeth's story, saw it as a tragic case of a young girl desperately trying to gain her mother's approval. Elizabeth's plea deal included testifying against Joan in exchange for a sentence ranging from 25 to 31 years. Joan, however, refused a similar deal, maintaining her innocence. She denied plotting David's murder and claimed she had no involvement in his death. Complicating the case further, Jeffrey Wilson, the man Joan had been romantically involved with, revealed that Joan had discussed running away with him using David's life insurance money. Additionally, another young man came forward, alleging that Joan had solicited him to commit the murder and dispose of the weapon. As the legal drama unfolded, Joan was left to face the court, her fate hanging in the balance. The complex web of deceit, manipulation, and familial betrayal made the Shannon case one of the most shocking and tragic examples of how desperate measures and troubled relationships can lead to unimaginable consequences. The trial stretched over a tense day and a half of deliberations. When the verdict finally came in, it was a harsh sentence for Joan. Found guilty of orchestrating David's murder, Joan was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole and no further appeals. Her attempt to shift blame onto Elizabeth had ultimately backfired, leaving her to face the full brunt of the law. Elizabeth, who had pulled the trigger, was given a plea deal in exchange for her testimony against Joan. Her sentence was set at a minimum of 25 years, reflecting her cooperation with the prosecution. Now, the mother-daughter duo is separated, each serving their sentences in different prisons just a few hours apart by car. So what do you think? Did Joan really manipulate Elizabeth into killing David? Or did Elizabeth act on her own to get rid of him? The case raises questions about parental influence, the lengths one might go to for a fractured family bond, and the tragic outcomes of desperate measures. Thanks for watching. Please like the video, press the subscribe button, and also drop your thoughts in the comment section.